The story of Leros begins not in the heat of battle, but in the silence of the Aegean Sea, a stretch of deep blue waters that once seemed far removed from the chaos engulfing Europe. By 1943, the tides of war had shifted, and with them came desperation, opportunity, and betrayal. When Italy surrendered to the Allies that September, the islands of the Deccanese, under Italian control for decades, suddenly became pawns in a deadly race between Germany and Britain for control of the eastern Mediterranean. Among them, the island of Leros, small, rugged, and isolated, would become the stage for one of the most tragic and forgotten confrontations of the war. For the British, Leros was a symbol of promise. Winston Churchill envisioned it as a foothold, a stepping stone that could open the way for Allied advances through the Aegean, perhaps even into the Balkans. To him, the islands represented not just geography, but destiny. To the Germans, however, Leros was a threat that had to be neutralized swiftly. The island's deep-water harbor, natural defenses, and location between Greece and Turkey made it a critical asset. Whoever controlled Leros could control the sea lanes, and in the final months of 1943, that meant everything. The story truly began in early September, when Italy's armistice with the Allies sent shockwaves through Europe. Overnight, former allies became enemies. Italian troops stationed across the Deccanese found themselves in a nightmare of divided loyalties. Some surrendered peacefully to the Germans. Others, outraged and confused, joined the British in resistance. On Leros, the commander, Captain Luigi Mascherpa, faced an impossible choice. His men were exhausted, undersupplied, and uncertain, yet he refused to yield to the Germans. When British commandos arrived soon after, bringing promises of reinforcements and air support, Mascherpa's garrison resolved to fight on, unaware of the storm that was already gathering. The first British troops landed in late September. They came from the Special Boat Service, elite commandos accustomed to stealth and sabotage. With them came small detachments of the Royal Irish Fusiliers, the King's Own, and the Royal Artillery. Their orders were simple: fortify the island, coordinate with the Italians, and hold it against any German assault. On paper, it seemed a defensible position. Leros' terrain, steep hills, narrow inlets, and winding coves offered natural protection. Italian guns overlooked key approaches, and British engineers began reinforcing bunkers and establishing anti-aircraft defenses. But even as the British dug in, German eyes were watching. The Luftwaffe began reconnaissance flights over the island within days, mapping every installation and gun emplacement. The German High Command, infuriated by Italy's defection, launched Operation Typhoon, a plan to seize Leros and the surrounding islands before the Allies could establish a permanent presence. General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, a ruthless commander known for his brutal tactics in Crete, was chosen to lead the assault. His orders were clear: crush the defenders, reclaim the Aegean, and make an example of those who resisted. By early October, the skies above Leros darkened with the drone of German bombers. The island's defenses were pounded daily by relentless air raids. Junkers U-88s and Stukas swooped low, targeting gun batteries, supply depots, and anti-aircraft positions. The harbors were set ablaze, and the small British flotilla, a handful of destroyers and supply ships, was forced to retreat. The defenders, now isolated, took shelter in caves and tunnels as the bombardment intensified. Communication with Allied headquarters in Cairo grew sporadic, and morale began to waver. But despite the inferno, the spirit of defiance endured. Italian and British soldiers, once enemies, now fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing rations, ammunition, and hardship. The language barrier mattered little; their bond was forged in necessity and survival. Captain Mascherpa coordinated closely with the British commander, Brigadier Tilney, as they prepared for the inevitable invasion. Makeshift command posts were established, guns repositioned, and camouflage nets spread across the hills. Every man understood that when the Germans came, there would be no retreat, only resistance. The bombing reached its peak in early November. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, and the once tranquil coves were littered with wreckage. Still, the defenders held firm. Every night, sentries scanned the horizon for signs of approaching enemy vessels. On November 12th, those signs appeared, faint silhouettes cutting through the dark waters of the Aegean. German landing craft, escorted by E-boats, were moving in. The invasion had begun. At dawn on November 13th, the Germans struck. The assault was sudden, coordinated, and brutal. Paratroopers descended from the sky while landing forces stormed the beaches. Stuka bombers roared overhead, their sirens screaming as they dived onto the coastal defenses. The harbors were set ablaze, and the small British flotilla, a handful of destroyers and supply ships, was forced to retreat. The defenders, now isolated, took shelter in caves and tunnels as the bombardment intensified. Communication with Allied headquarters in Cairo grew sporadic, and morale began to waver. But despite the inferno, the spirit of defiance endured. Italian and British soldiers, once enemies, now fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing rations, ammunition, and hardship. The language barrier mattered little, their bond was forged in necessity and survival. Captain Masherpa coordinated closely with the British commander, Brigadier Tilney, as they prepared for the inevitable invasion. Makeshift command posts were established, guns repositioned, and camouflage nets spread across the hills. Every man understood that when the Germans came, there would be no retreat, only resistance. The bombing reached its peak in early November. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, and the once tranquil coves were littered with wreckage. Still, the defenders held firm. Every night, sentries scanned the horizon for signs of approaching enemy vessels. On November 12th, those signs appeared, faint silhouettes cutting through the dark waters of the Aegean. German landing craft, escorted by E-boats, were moving in. The invasion had begun. At dawn on November 13th, the Germans struck. The assault was sudden, coordinated, and brutal. Paratroopers descended from the sky while landing forces stormed the beaches. Stuka bombers roared overhead, their sirens screaming as they dived onto the coastal defenses. The harbors were set ablaze, and the small British flotilla, a handful of destroyers and supply ships, was forced to retreat. The defenders, now isolated, took shelter in caves and tunnels as the bombardment intensified. Communication with Allied headquarters in Cairo grew sporadic, and morale began to waver. But despite the inferno, the spirit of defiance endured. Italian and British soldiers, once enemies, now fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing rations, ammunition, and hardship. The language barrier mattered little, their bond was forged in necessity and survival. Captain Masherpa coordinated closely with the British commander, Brigadier Tilney, as they prepared for the inevitable invasion. Makeshift command posts were established, guns repositioned, and camouflage nets spread across the hills. Every man understood that when the Germans came, there would be no retreat, only resistance. The bombing reached its peak in early November. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, and the once tranquil coves were littered with wreckage. Still, the defenders held firm. Every night, sentries scanned the horizon for signs of approaching enemy vessels. On November 12th, those signs appeared, faint silhouettes cutting through the dark waters of the Aegean. German landing craft, escorted by E-boats, were moving in. The invasion had begun. At dawn on November 13th, the Germans struck. The assault was sudden, coordinated, and brutal. Paratroopers descended from the sky while landing forces stormed the beaches. Stuka bombers roared overhead, their sirens screaming as they dived onto the coastal defenses. The harbors were set ablaze, and the small British flotilla, a handful of destroyers and supply ships, was forced to retreat. The defenders, now isolated, took shelter in caves and tunnels as the bombardment intensified. Communication with Allied headquarters in Cairo grew sporadic, and morale began to waver. But despite the inferno, the spirit of defiance endured. Italian and British soldiers, once enemies, now fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing rations, ammunition, and hardship. The language barrier mattered little, their bond was forged in necessity and survival. Captain Masherpa coordinated closely with the British commander, Brigadier Tilney, as they prepared for the inevitable invasion. Makeshift command posts were established, guns repositioned, and camouflage nets spread across the hills. Every man understood that when the Germans came, there would be no retreat, only resistance. The bombing reached its peak in early November. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, and the once tranquil coves were littered with wreckage. Still, the defenders held firm. Every night, sentries scanned the horizon for signs of approaching enemy vessels. On November 12th, those signs appeared, faint silhouettes cutting through the dark waters of the Aegean. German landing craft, escorted by E-boats, were moving in. The invasion had begun. At dawn on November 13th, the Germans struck. The assault was sudden, coordinated, and brutal. Paratroopers descended from the sky while landing forces stormed the beaches. Stuka bombers roared overhead, their sirens screaming as they dived onto the coastal defenses. The harbors were set ablaze, and the small British flotilla, a handful of destroyers and supply ships, was forced to retreat. The defenders, now isolated, took shelter in caves and tunnels as the bombardment intensified. Communication with allies. The night after the German landings was one of smoke, silence, and fear. The defenders of Leros, scattered across ridgelines and shattered strongpoints, knew the enemy was everywhere, but could not tell how far he had advanced. Radio communication had broken down almost completely. In the darkness, British and Italian patrols whispered passwords through the rubble, sometimes mistaking friend for foe. Flares burst in the distance, casting fleeting shadows on the faces of men too tired to stand, but too alert to sleep. The battle for the island had turned from strategy to survival. Brigadier Robert Tilney, commanding the British forces, gathered what remained of his staff inside a half-ruined command post at Meraviglia. His situation map was little more than guesswork, but he could still see one truth. The Germans had established beachheads on both the north and south coasts. Their paratroopers had seized high ground around Mount Clytie, giving them a commanding view of the island's interior. Unless those heights were retaken, the defenders would be trapped between converging German forces. Tilney ordered immediate counterattacks at dawn, using whatever troops could be assembled: British infantry, Italian Marines, and remnants of the island's garrison artillery. Captain Luigi Mascherpa, still coordinating the Italian contingent, was equally grim. His men had fought heroically, but suffered heavy casualties. Ammunition was running low, and many guns had been destroyed by the relentless air bombardment. Yet, he refused to abandon the fight. The defense of Leros, he told his officers, was not only a military duty, but an act of honor to show that Italy, though broken and betrayed by its leaders, still possessed courage. His message spread through the ranks, giving weary soldiers a renewed sense of purpose. At dawn, the counterattack began. The defenders, moving through the rocky hills and olive groves, advanced under a sky streaked with smoke. British commandos from the King's Own and the Royal Irish Fusiliers led the charge toward Mount Clytie, supported by Italian gunners firing the few operational artillery pieces left. The terrain was brutal, steep, exposed, and riddled with German machine gun nests. Yet they pressed on, climbing through shattered stone walls and twisted wreckage. For a brief moment, it seemed the tide might turn. The defenders reached the lower slopes and engaged the German paratroopers in savage close combat. Grenades echoed among the rocks, and the air was filled with shouted orders in English, Italian, and German. But the Germans countered swiftly. From above, Stukas returned to hammer the attackers, diving almost vertically and releasing their bombs with terrifying precision. The explosions tore through the advancing ranks, scattering men and shattering any momentum. The defenders fell back once more, leaving the heights in German hands. By midday, the counterattack had collapsed. The British and Italians regrouped behind hastily dug trenches, their faces blackened by smoke and exhaustion. Meanwhile, at sea, the situation was equally dire. British naval reinforcements attempting to reach Leros were intercepted by German aircraft. Several destroyers were damaged or sunk in the narrow channels of the Aegean, forcing the Royal Navy to withdraw. The defenders on the island were now completely isolated. Supplies dwindled to a fraction of what was needed. Food, water, and medical stores were nearly gone. Ammunition was rationed, and wounded soldiers lay in makeshift shelters with little hope of evacuation. Still, there was no thought of surrender. The defenders continued to fight from hill to hill, their determination fueled by desperation. Small groups of commandos carried out night raids against German positions, ambushing patrols and sabotaging supply dumps. The Italians fought tenaciously, manning anti-aircraft guns, even as the Luftwaffe maintained near-total control of the skies. Each day brought new attacks, each night new losses. By November 15th, the German advance had become systematic. They pushed inland from the northern beaches, capturing key positions one after another. Mount Clytie fell completely, followed by the ridges overlooking Lockheed Bay. German artillery began targeting British command posts and cutting off the island's defenders into isolated pockets. Every road was under fire. Even moving supplies between positions was suicidal. Yet, in that chaos, acts of extraordinary valor continued. One small detachment of British and Italian troops held out at a battery near Point 320, refusing to yield even after being surrounded. For 2 days they fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets until their ammunition was gone. When finally captured, the Germans saluted them for their courage. Elsewhere, Italian gunners used their last shells to sink a German landing craft before being overrun. Every inch of Leros was paid for in blood. Back at British headquarters, Tilney faced the unthinkable. The island could not be held much longer. Reinforcements were impossible, and his remaining forces were being ground down. Still, he hoped that by prolonging the defense, he might tie down enough German troops to aid Allied operations elsewhere in the Mediterranean. His orders were to resist to the last practical moment, and that moment, he believed, had not yet arrived. As the sun set on November 16th, the battle reached a new level of intensity. German forces launched coordinated assaults from the north and south simultaneously, aiming to cut the island in half. Paratroopers dropped again to reinforce the southern front, while artillery pounded British positions around Lockheed Bay. The defenders dug into trenches and caves, returned fire with dwindling ammunition. The night sky glowed with tracer fire and burning fuel. Every explosion illuminated the ruins of what had once been a peaceful island community. Amid the chaos, the civilian population suffered terribly. Many had taken refuge in caves, sharing what little food remained with the soldiers. Children huddled beside their mothers as the ground trembled with constant shell fire. The people of Leros, caught between empires, endured the nightmare silently, praying for the end of the bombardment that seemed to have no limit. By November 17th, the situation had become untenable. The Germans had seized the heights overlooking the main harbor and were pouring artillery fire directly onto the remaining British positions. Command posts were destroyed one by one. Messages to Cairo were unanswered. Tilney convened his last council of war. Masherpa, pale and exhausted, argued to continue the fight, but even he knew it was hopeless. The men had done all that could be expected, perhaps more. At 1:30 p.m. on November 16th, Brigadier Tilney gave the order to prepare for surrender. Yet, surrender did not come easily. Many detachments refused to lay down their arms. Commandos in the hills fought on for another day, unaware that the order had been given. Others destroyed their weapons and equipment before the Germans could capture them. When the white flags were finally raised, the island was a wasteland of smoke and ruin. The Germans moved swiftly to consolidate control. Brigadier Tilney and Captain Masherpa were taken prisoner, along with more than 3,000 British and 5,000 Italian troops. The battle was over. The Aegean had once again fallen under German domination. The victory, though tactically impressive, came at a cost. Hundreds of Germans lay dead, and the island's infrastructure was annihilated. The strategic value of Leros was questionable, but for Hitler, the symbolism was everything. He had avenged Italy's betrayal and demonstrated that Germany still ruled the Mediterranean. For the Allies, the loss was devastating. Churchill's grand vision of a Balkan advance through the Aegean collapsed overnight. The failure at Leros marked the end of British ambitions in the region. The Royal Navy retreated to safer waters, and Allied focus shifted permanently toward Italy and Western Europe. In the shadow of greater campaigns, Normandy, Anzio, Arnhem, the story of Leros faded from memory. But for those who fought there, it was never forgotten. Survivors would later recall the battle not as a failure, but as a testament to courage under impossible odds. A symbol of unity between men who had once been enemies standing side by side against overwhelming force. The hills of Leros still bear the scars of that struggle. When the guns at last fell silent over Leros, the island seemed to exhale a long, broken breath. Smoke hung low across the hills, the air thick with the bitter scent of cordite and burned earth. The once blue waters of Lockheed Bay were slick with oil and debris, shattered boats drifting aimlessly among lifeless bodies. The echoes of battle faded into a strange, oppressive quiet, a quiet filled not with peace, but with exhaustion and grief. For those who survived, surrender was not relief, it was a reckoning. The German occupation forces moved swiftly to secure the island. Paratroopers and Marines combed through the ruins, rounding up British and Italian soldiers who had thrown down their weapons. Many were dazed, wounded, or barely able to walk. They were herded together in the courtyards of what remained of the barracks, guarded by men who only hours earlier had been locked in mortal combat with them. The German commander, General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, already infamous in Crete for his brutal treatment of prisoners, arrived to oversee the aftermath personally. His orders were clear: establish total control, make an example of resistance, and deal harshly with anyone who defied German authority. Müller viewed the Italians with particular contempt, considering them traitors to the Axis. For the British, he held professional respect, but no mercy. Brigadier Tilney was brought before Müller under heavy guard. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot, but his bearing was still upright. Müller's interrogation was brief and cold. The British commander explained that his men had fought to the last practicable moment as his orders demanded. Müller simply nodded and replied, "Your resistance was stubborn, but futile." Then without further comment, Tilney was taken away as a prisoner of war, eventually transported to camps in Germany. The fate of the Italians was far darker. Captain Luigi Mascherpa, who had commanded his men with unwavering resolve throughout the siege, was treated as a traitor. Despite having fought bravely alongside the British, he was arrested, court-martialed by the Germans, and later executed by firing squad. His death sent shockwaves through the surviving Italian ranks. Many of his men wept openly as they were marched away under guard. In the years that followed, Mascherpa's name would be remembered as a symbol of honor, a man who chose loyalty to his conscience over submission to tyranny. In the days that followed, the Germans turned their attention to the civilians. The people of Leros, who had endured weeks of bombardment, now faced occupation. Villagers emerged cautiously from caves and cellars to find their homes destroyed, their livestock dead, and their wills poisoned with debris. The Luftwaffe's relentless attacks had left entire neighborhoods in ruins. German patrols moved through the settlements, confiscating what little food and supplies remained. Those who resisted or were suspected of aiding the British were beaten or shot. For the small Greek population of the island, life under German rule was suffocating. The occupiers imposed curfews, seized fishing boats, and forced men into labor battalions. Women and children scavenged for food in the rubble, living on stale bread and rainwater. Diseases spread quickly, carried by malnutrition and overcrowding. Yet even in the face of such hardship, the people of Leros maintained a quiet defiance. Some hid wounded Allied soldiers in caves. Others passed information to the resistance networks that still operated from nearby islands. The British and Italian prisoners were gathered and shipped north in overcrowded vessels. Many never made it to their destination.
German submarines patrolled the Aegean without mercy, and Allied aircraft hunted Axis convoys. One of the transport ships, carrying hundreds of Italian prisoners captured at Leros, was torpedoed and sunk by mistake by an Allied submarine, a tragic irony that claimed the lives of men who had fought for the same cause. Survivors clung to floating wreckage for hours before being rescued, only to be sent to prison camps deep inside the Reich. Back on the island, the German garrison fortified its new possession. Engineers rebuilt the airfields, repaired bunkers, and installed radar stations to monitor the eastern Mediterranean. Leros, once seen by Churchill as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Aegean, now became a bastion of the German defensive line. Yet its strategic importance diminished rapidly as the war shifted elsewhere. The Allied advance through Italy rendered the Dodecanese increasingly isolated. Supplies to the garrison grew thin, morale faltered, and the tropical diseases of the Aegean began to take their toll. Meanwhile, news of the defeat reached London and Cairo with a heavy silence. Churchill, deeply invested in the Dodecanese campaign, was devastated. He had believed that holding the islands would draw Turkey into the war and open a new front in southeastern Europe. Instead, Leros became a symbol of overreach, a tragic reminder of what happened when bold strategy met harsh logistics. The Royal Navy, bloodied and stretched thin, could not challenge German air superiority in the Aegean. It was one of the few instances in the war where Britain's maritime strength failed to deliver. In the corridors of Allied command, recriminations followed. Some blamed poor coordination between the British and Italians. Others faulted the lack of air cover or the underestimation of German capabilities. But for the men who had fought on the island, the reasons mattered little. They remembered the battle not as a blunder, but as a desperate stand against overwhelming odds. Letters from survivors, smuggled from prisoner of war camps, spoke of comradeship, bravery, and the haunting beauty of the island that had become their battlefield. The story of Leros soon faded from public attention, overshadowed by the titanic events unfolding in Europe, the Normandy landings, the Eastern Front, the liberation of Rome. Yet in the Aegean, the memory lingered. The sea that surrounded the island still held the wrecks of ships and planes, silent witnesses to the ferocity of the struggle. The hills were dotted with unmarked graves, some known only to the wind and the goats that roamed freely among them. In the winter of 1944, the war began to turn decisively against Germany. Allied bombers ranged freely across Europe, and the Red Army pushed inexorably westward. The garrison on Leros grew increasingly isolated. Supply ships were sunk, and communication with the mainland became sporadic. German troops began to scavenge the island for food, dismantling abandoned houses and raiding Greek storehouses. Civilians who had endured more than a year of occupation were reduced to bartering fish for bread. Yet even under these conditions, small acts of defiance persisted. A few Greek fishermen risked their lives to ferry messages to British agents operating from the nearby island of Samos. Others hid escaped prisoners or provided false reports to German patrols. By mid-1944, rumors reached the island that the Allies had landed in Normandy and that Germany was retreating in France. The news, whispered in secret among prisoners and civilians, brought a fragile hope. The Germans, though still formidable, were no longer invincible. The once proud paratroopers who had conquered Leros now looked weary and malnourished. Their uniforms were patched, their rations meager. Some even traded cigarettes for bread with Greek children. The iron discipline began to erode. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the German garrison on Leros was among the last to surrender. Cut off from the world, they had received only fragments of information about the collapse of the Reich. It was a British destroyer that finally arrived to take their surrender. The German commander handed over his pistol in silence, his men lining up to be taken prisoner. For the people of Leros, liberation came without celebration. They were too tired, too scarred. The war had taken everything: their homes, their fathers, their peace. The aftermath of the battle left deep marks that would last for generations. Many of the surviving Italian soldiers never returned home, lost in the chaos of prisoner transports or post-war reprisals. British veterans who had fought on Leros carried the memory of the island as both a badge of honor and a wound that never fully healed. The official histories of the war mentioned the battle only briefly, describing it as a gallant but ill-fated operation. But in the letters and diaries of those who were there, Leros lived on as a place of courage, comradeship, and tragedy. Over the years, historians revisited the campaign, recognizing Leros as one of the last great amphibious battles of the Second World War fought in the Mediterranean. It was a battle that had no grand victory, no sweeping triumph, but it revealed something deeper: the endurance of men caught in the machinery of history, fighting not for conquest, but for each other.
When the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the island of Leros lay adrift in the Aegean, a scarred relic of a war that had moved on. The olive groves were silent again, save for the wind and the slow murmur of the sea against the shattered piers. The people of the island emerged from years of occupation and deprivation into a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. For them, liberation was not a parade, it was a slow, uncertain awakening from trauma. The British forces returned first. A small detachment landed quietly, accepting the German surrender from the weary garrison that had clung to the island even after the Reich had collapsed. The German commander, once stern and proud, now appeared gaunt and resigned. He saluted the British officer before him, handed over his Luger pistol, and was led away without words. Around him, his men stacked their rifles in neat rows, their boots scraping on the same stones where so many had fallen. The Union Jack was raised once more over the fortress of Lochy, but there was no cheer. The Greek civilians watched from a distance, their faces expressionless. For them, the flag meant survival, perhaps a return to normal life, but also the memory of loss. The war had not only destroyed their homes, it had taken their sense of safety, their trust in the world. British medical teams began their grim task, clearing mines, burying the dead, and searching for prisoners who had been hidden or left behind. The burial parties worked in silence, moving from one makeshift grave to another. Some graves bore crude wooden crosses, others nothing at all. The chaplains said prayers over rows of unknown men, British, Italian, German, whose remains could no longer be distinguished. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the ceremony, indifferent, as the earth was sealed over once again. Among the returning officers was a young naval intelligence officer named Peter Davis, who had served briefly in the Dodecanese before the fall of Leros. He wrote in his diary, "There are no victories here, only ghosts. The hills whisper of courage, of men who refuse to yield, but their names are carried only by the wind." For months after the German surrender, the island remained a strange limbo. The war had ended elsewhere, but here its echoes continued. The German prisoners were shipped out in groups, first to Egypt and then to camps in Britain. The Italians who had survived imprisonment began the long journey home, many uncertain what awaited them in a country torn between shame and reconstruction. Of the British garrison that had fought so fiercely, only a fraction returned. The rest laid buried in the foreign soil of the Aegean, the island of valiant ghosts, as one survivor later called it. The post-war years brought little peace to Leros. The island was returned to Greek control in 1948, after years of being shuffled between occupiers and administrators. By then, Greece itself was torn by civil war, and Leros became once again a backwater, forgotten by the world. The population dwindled as families emigrated to the mainland or abroad. The old Italian forts crumbled under the salt and wind, their concrete bunkers slowly reclaimed by weeds. The rusting wrecks of ships still dotted the coastline, some half sunk, others resting like skeletal monuments on the seabed. But beneath this quiet decay, stories began to resurface. Fishermen spoke of strange finds: helmets, dog tags, waterlogged letters sealed in bottles. Children played among the ruins, unaware that their playgrounds had once been killing grounds. In the 1950s, a team of British naval historians visited the island to document the remnants of the battle. They interviewed locals who remembered the bombing raids, the parachute landings, the desperate days when the sky never seemed to darken from the smoke. One old fisherman, Nikos, recalled how he had hidden 2 wounded soldiers in a cave near the coast. He said, "They were enemies, but they were boys, and they were dying. So I gave them water, and I prayed for their mothers." His story was simple, but it captured something that the official histories could not: the small mercies that survived amid destruction. Back in Britain, Leros was seldom mentioned. It was an uncomfortable memory for a nation that preferred to recall its triumphs: El Alamein, Normandy, the liberation of Europe. The Dodecanese campaign had been a failure, a costly miscalculation that exposed the limits of Allied power in 1943. Churchill himself admitted privately that Leros was a tragedy of gallant men sent into the jaws of fate. In public, he rarely spoke of it again. For the veterans who had fought there, the silence was harder to bear than the defeat itself. Many returned home to find little recognition of their ordeal. Their comrades had died on a distant island few people could find on a map. Letters to the War Office went unanswered, and memorials were built for battles deemed more decisive. Some men wrote their own accounts, self-published memoirs and fading journal entries, trying to preserve the truth before it vanished. One such account, written by Sergeant Arthur Hales, described the battle in unvarnished terms. "We held on because we were told to. We fought until the bombs stopped falling, and when they didn't, we fought anyway." Leros wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to give up. In Italy, the story of Leros took on a different meaning. The Italian soldiers who had fought and died there were celebrated as patriots who had defied fascism and chosen freedom. Captain Luigi Maschera, executed by the Germans for siding with the Allies, was posthumously awarded the Gold Medal of Military Valor. Streets and barracks were named in his honor. His last letter to his wife, written hours before his execution, became a symbol of Italian resistance. "I die as a soldier and as a man of honor. Tell our children that I did not betray them." Over time, scholars and historians began to revisit the Dodecanese campaign, reevaluating its significance. They saw in Leros not just a failed military operation, but a turning point, a moment when the shifting allegiances of Italy, Germany, and the Allies collided in tragic consequence. It exposed the fragility of wartime alliances and the cost of miscommunication. It was also, in a quiet way, a story of human endurance under impossible odds. In the 1960s and 70s, divers began exploring the waters around Leros. What they found transformed the island into a museum of war. The seabed was littered with relics: fighter planes, artillery shells, sunken landing craft. Among the most haunting discoveries was the wreck of the Greek destroyer Vasilisa Olga, which had gone down in Lochy Harbor during the early stages of the campaign. The ship's twisted hull became a shrine for visiting veterans and locals alike. As tourism slowly reached the Dodecanese in the latter half of the 20th century, Leros remained largely untouched by commercial development. travelers who came expecting beaches found instead an island steeped in ghosts. The hills still bore the scars of shellfire, the roads wound past abandoned bunkers, and the silence of the landscape seemed to carry the weight of unspoken memory. For some visitors, that was precisely the appeal, a place where history still whispered beneath the surface. In 1990, on the 50th anniversary of the Italian occupation of Leros, a memorial ceremony was held at the British War Cemetery overlooking Olinda Bay. Veterans from Britain, Italy, and even Germany attended, standing side by side under a blue Aegean sky. Wreaths were laid, speeches given, but it was the silence that followed that said the most. A British veteran named John Fraser, who had survived the bombardment and captivity, summed it up simply. "We were enemies once, but here we all bled on the same ground. Leros belongs to none of us, only to the dead." The island itself began to embrace its history more openly. The Greek government designated several wartime sites as historical monuments, and local museums began collecting relics and testimonies from the era. Visitors could now walk through the tunnels of the old Italian forts, their walls still bearing faded slogans and bullet holes. Schoolchildren were taught about the battle, not as a distant foreign war, but as part of their own island story, a story of resilience, tragedy, and survival. In the digital age, historians and filmmakers rediscovered Leros once more. Archival footage, declassified military documents, and personal letters brought the story to new audiences. Documentaries highlighted the human dimension, the friendships between British and Italian soldiers, the civilians who hid the wounded, the German paratroopers